Hello and welcome to RPG Book Club number, I believe it is 59, I think. Today we're taking a look at Simple D100 Fantasy, which is a D100 based game inspired by basic fantasy role playing, but simplified a little bit and probably with a bit more modern conventions, I would guess. It's got certainly some eye-catching art on the cover. We'll see if we can find who did that as we go on, because the only credit I've seen so far is the writing credit for the creator. Not clear if they also did the art or they sourced it from somewhere else. Let's see. Yeah, this PDF is specifically the character creation one. There's different ones for general rules and for GM rules in addition, I believe. Not a bad organization, it seems like, for the table of contents, though I would maybe have some information on how to roll at least under what players do, but we'll see if there is or not. Interesting tidbit here. I should check how many pages this is. 43, that's not too much to look through. Okay, so they do have some information on checks. Though personally, I'd like say you roll below a value based on a character's skill or something, or however it goes. I feel like you can have that much in there too. Just make things easier for people to understand what they're working with from the beginning, that you don't have to get into full specifics. Okay, characters are typically defined through skills. That's an important distinction to make note of. Okay, so they explain it there. That's nice. Okay, so yeah, I think I get it. It's the whatever die determines the 10 place becomes the quote unquote quality. And that is only important for successful rolls, I think. Because it says the higher a successful roll is, the better you succeed. Yeah, the higher a successful roll is interesting. Yeah, so with this combination of rules, it should probably be possible. I'll have to know more about the modifiers to be sure, but it should probably be possible to sort of set an impossible check by having. Well, actually, you know what? I just completely forgot how. What do you call it? How these systems typically work, where it's not a difficulty value you're beating, it's just your own skill. So it wouldn't be a check that you have to get below and in addition a difficulty. It would just be the difficulty and your skill. So whether a check would end up being impossible for your character wouldn't be set by, the DM arbitrarily. It would be based on whether your skill is adequately high enough that you could get a high roll and still have that roll be under your skill. To explain it a little more, though, I'm sure anyone listening probably gets it by now. If something has a difficulty of 5, say, you would need a skill of at least 51 in order to be successful at it. Because if you can't roll a 50 and have it be below your skill, then that roll wouldn't be high enough to beat the difficulty of 5 as well as be under the skill. I'm not exactly sure how it would be pre-calculated during character creation if it's against an opponent, but is that only opponents are the players or something? I had to step away for a second, but from this it looks like the difficulty threshold that is determined at character creation for opposed situations is the character creation of the enemy NPC, which, isn't normally called character creation, so that makes things a little complicated, but maybe it also refers to player characters under certain circumstances. And I saw this too. That's a fairly interesting way to do advantage and disadvantage. And what I think it comes out to mean, you can flip the thing that's in the tens place in the ones place. So if you can change 36 to 63 and vice versa. And I think what that means is when you have advantage, it's better to have each die have a fairly different result. Because, A, that gives you more options, and B, that means you can change a roll that is too high to one that is lower, or a roll that is too low to one that is higher. Because a roll can either be too high or too low, depending on whether your skill value is causing you to fail, or the difficulty value is causing you to fail. For disadvantage, it's probably the opposite, where it's ideal to have a roll that is successful and where neither number is that different than the other, so flipping it won't change anything. Okay, and whenever you roll the same on the 10s and the 1s, that is an exceptional roll. That should be a 1 in 10 chance to be exceptional. Okay, that's interesting. It's, whether it's a critical success or failure depends on whether the value of the roll itself would be succeeding or failing. I've never seen something like that before, but that means there's a 1 in 10 chance that every success you make, each success you make has a 1 in 10 chance of being really good, and each failure you make has a 1 in 10 chance of being really bad. It also means that, unlike a lot of critical success versus critical failure systems, in critical failure systems, you are more likely to critically succeed than to critically fail, as long as it is a skill you are good at. So that's good to know. That'll change things a lot. Around 40 skills, that's certainly quite a few, especially for a simple game, but we'll see. Yeah, some composite things as well, which also adds to complexity. Okay, so yeah, it's interesting to see how character skill increases will occur without leveling. And having you select from different kits instead of picking a profession. This makes it sound like you're selecting, from multiple different kits rather than just picking 1 out of 10, because that would be effectively the same as the class. But having choices like that can either make things where you make a couple simple choices that add a few things instead of being locked into a class per se. That can either increase or decrease sort of the level of complexity a player actually is conscious of in making decisions at the outset, and would probably increase overall complexity, but we'll have to see how that actually manifests instead of just theorizing. So not necessarily focused on a lot of combat. Okay, 2 different sort of health meters, quote unquote. That's another thing that might end up making things fairly complex. We'll have to see. Okay, and 2 additional ones as well. So that's certainly quite a bit. Let's see if I can actually see anything that means something on the bottom. There's a name there, but I don't know if that's really the name of the artist or that's sort of like an in-universe name, so to speak. At the same time, the game assumes a fantasy setting. Okay. Not likely to see elves and dwarves, which is something I would find odd for, an agnostic system. But I guess you could make an argument for the other way around. Interesting. That the consequence dispels his guilt, and that's sort of because it might be like an unfair advantage in a way. That's interesting. Combine the result for a number between 0, 1 and 0, 0 or 100. Yeah, okay, so that's phrased badly. I think they just mean combine for the results for a number between 0, 1 or 100, and 100 is represented by 0, 0. But the way it's here, it just sounds like the results for a number between 1 and 0 or 100, which is just confusing. Especially since, like, 100 is 0, 0, 0, technically, I think. I've never been good at reading D100s, though. I always forget how they're supposed to work. Okay, so whether the whole 0 thing here says it's context sensitive, and if it's actually context sensitive in terms of the rules of the game, that's good to mention. Or if you're just saying, it's either just saying that if you're rolling a 10-sided die by itself, it's always 10, but for the D100 setup, it might be 0. That's kind of unnecessary because this is always going to be D100s, I'm pretty sure. At least that's what it seemed like so far. On the other hand, it might just be referencing that things get complicated when you switch the value of the die as for advantage or disadvantage. Basically, what I'm saying is, if this is just about establishing something that is very niche, I would probably skip it over at this stage, personally. Okay. Never mind, I wasn't reading properly. Because you are using different values of dice effectively, and you are using the D10. Okay. So that all works out, probably. Yep, have the result. It doesn't tell you which way to round, which would be rounding up, but most people would probably figure that out. Okay, fair. Okay, the threshold is the tens digit of half of the skill value rounded down. Okay, so it's used for some certain calculations, probably threshold and opposed things, but also it can auto-pass you on rolls, it looks like. I'll have to see how that plays out. Value of the tens die, yep. Needed to achieve something. Okay. Yeah. This terminology sort of implies that you can consciously choose whether or not to take damage to your guard in order, like, that if there was a situation where it would be preferable to conserve your guard by taking health damage, that you can, and I don't know if that's actually the case. Yeah. It's also interesting that guilt is an ambiguous term. It could mean how much guilt your character feels, or how guilty your character is of a certain thing. Okay, 10 seconds. It looks like a turn is 10 seconds. I think for D&D it's like 6 seconds or something. Okay. Yeah, I get that, having encumbrance be the term for how much weight you're carrying is kind of standard, but I always thought it was a bad way of terming things when, the phrase for having too much of it is encumbered, because that can kind of get confusing. Okay, skill chapter. Yep. Right, so that is sort of acknowledging that the system has a level of complexity, but it is giving you a tool to try to aid with that. Alright. Okay, name and concept. And then species. Because you'd think you would have to pick species as part of concept. It's usually pretty relevant. And it looks like you specifically have to roll for the circumstances. You can't pick them, or if you can, they just aren't mentioning it at this point. When the character creation process of a game is involved, I think it's generally better to have a lot of it, at least the details of that character's life, be determined by the player, because they're going to have to be pretty invested in it all, since it's such an involved process. And even down to personality traits, that does make you wonder, like, are these just mechanical, or is it also supposed to be about your character? And if that's the case, how can you come up with a concept for a character before you even know their personality traits? Okay, note the basic equipment you get. Is that based on rolling on the table? I would think so, because it's not saying choose, it's just saying note it. Okay, and then 14 years old. Okay, up to 4 kits. Why would you want to do less? Is there some sort of cost? So it also depends on your age, because you add 4 years for each kit, maybe. Okay. Okay, so there's some free stuff, but a lot of it is determined, though I guess, you pick the kit, so those are effectively chosen by you anyway, the quote-unquote appropriate skills. Okay, skill increase and transfer them to your character sheet. Yep. Okay, threshold table. Calculate those. Okay, you can purchase your starting gear. Okay, you bring the background together based on your history. It's always nice to see people actually thinking about how to bring your character together in character creation, because sometimes that looks over, but that's being mentioned. Okay, decide how you are as a person. That's, once again, sort of in similar vein to think of a concept, but this far along it makes more sense that you would be able to after rolling for certain predetermined elements. Okay, write down gear stuff. Okay, you can ignore all those rules and spend 700 points to buy skills. What about equipment and other various things? Of points spent in the system described here is base chances 300. I don't know what that means. Note down the base chances for each skill. Okay. So that's part of birth. So something you would normally get at birth, you spend 300 points on. Your species, you spend 100 points on. And I am guessing that is, your species comes with skills and ability. I'm guessing you are just buying those instead, but are you buying those on specific species-based skills, or how exactly does that work? I'd have to look. Unless it's 100, 1 kit, 100, 4 kits, 400. Or are you like saying like that's how the points correlate to things that have been done in the default template, but don't at all reflect how you should actually spend points if you are doing point buy? That's not really clear. Okay, so it looks like they're just saying that, the 700 is based on you effectively getting that much. Based on, this stuff, all of this stuff comes out about to 900 if you're doing 4 kits. 600 if you're doing 1, and so they just give you 700 if you're ignoring all of it. But I do feel it's kind of less clear than it could be. More or less heroic characters. It also might, be nice to have sort of a middle option, because this looks like this is the way to avoid having to roll your personality traits and stuff, but it also does away with every other process of character creation effectively. So it might be nice to have something in the middle where you have a bit more control, but you have an actual process to follow still. More or less heroic characters. Okay, but is it add 1 or 2 kit selections to 1 or to 4? But basically, one of the reasons you might not go with 4 kits is just to have things be lower level and grittier, I guess. That seems like it would only decrease things by 100 points per kit. Alright. Okay, that's good to know and have covered. If you go over the limit, you just switch to another skill instead of redoing everything. And so by concept, they basically mean just what kind of build you think you're going to go for. That makes a little more sense, but, it's not necessarily what I would normally call concept. she rolls on the culture table. Okay. And farmer's daughter was a result of that 4, I guess, and then she rolls for health. It's not really clear how this process is occurring, which might be fine because it's an example, but I'm just sort of confused by that example. Like, you'd think, okay, so yeah, I'm not really sure if the plus 20 to skills listed is just from the race or from the roll of the culture table plus the race or something. Now, I would assume this is something you would have to do for point buy, but like I said, it's really not clear how exactly point buy is supposed to work. Because if you read it, you potentially could just ignore giving your... Like, it doesn't say anything that you have to follow the format in any way. You could just ignore giving your character a species at all. Like, it says just ignore all these rules, and maybe this is meant to say that you have to, like, spend 100 on species, but it doesn't seem like that. I feel like there needs to be a lot more details for that system. Okay, 5 skills and you add 20. Then decide if they have any special features, but no real details about those features. Does features just mean like appearance or something else? Okay, and what does that last part refer to mechanically? Yeah, this is also, like I said, kind of confusing to me. Like, that part, very simple. What exactly this part is supposed to mean, less simple. I'm not entirely sure. Okay, so now we're getting into rolling being optional and versus deciding. We'll have to see if that carries through for other things they've referred to as rolls. And there's not really much of a description for humans. Okay, Ermalulu? I don't quite know how you would pronounce that. No, that's not uncommon for RPGs. Okay, always amount to plus 10 in total, so I'm guessing that means you can't have the health and sanity combined be greater than 10 for a custom thing. And maybe, that just means you use that to determine whether health bonus and sanity bonus are less or more than human, but it's pretty vague. Alright. You always potentially want to be careful about making delineated roles for men and women in society for a race. It makes sense for lions, but you never know how people are going to react. Just something to think about. And it looks like there are not different SKUs for the lion folk, nor the lizard folk. It's amusing that you've gone, to an extent, the opposite of what you might consider typical, which is the animal-like race, having the head of an animal but more the body of a man, whereas these have the head of a person, but no, a human rather, but the body is furry. Oh, well. Eyes are dog-like and they have accentuated noses, so they're not quite human-headed, I would think. And it's interesting that they are more human-like in face than the lion folk or the lizard folk, since they are, able to procreate with humans and are shunned by them, so they're sort of like closer to humans than a lot of the other races or species, but that leads to potential discrimination. What was I looking at here? Brawl, stealth, scout, perception, endurance. It's a little odd, dude. Except for scout, there's not a ton about actually surviving in the wild lands like they do. Yeah, also, can't remember if I mentioned that, but, looks like only the humans have specific SKUs to them. It does look like only, humans have a culture table so far, so it's kind of odd that it's mentioned so prominently. Okay, that's interesting. Alright. Because so far I haven't seen a lot of mechanics for these guys, but the scorpion folk appear to have quite a few. Yeah, the bonuses are standards. Okay, so this is just a net benefit, it looks like. This part is a little ambiguous. I don't know if that actually does anything mechanically or it's just kind of flavor. And this has an upside and a downside because they can't wear armor other than their natural armor. So I'd have to know more about how armor works to know how much of this just being a net positive affects how this species works compared to the other ones. Because they do have something that might have a bit of a downside at least. Now, I don't know that plus 10 would be good in an attack, assuming that it's still a mostly roll under system. But I guess you have the option to pick which one it is, depending on what you assume the difficulty value to be, because having a plus 10 can still be useful depending on the difficulty value. But again, it looks like they have a bonus thing that other races don't, and they don't have any negative, including to their health and sanity values. So, these just seem better than some of the others based on that. So this one, it doesn't give you the option to pick, you just have to roll on it. Yeah, so the two that definitively have mechanical effects appear to be these ones. It's interesting that you don't have to start with the noble kit as a noble. Okay, so we've got both. We've got adolescence, but if I go back up, I can see here, note down the basic chances for each skill or use the pre-printed ones. I still don't really know what that means. Like, is that just from species, or... because it's part of birth, though. I don't know what that's in reference to still, especially since... since base chances give you 300. Maybe... like, every skill has a automatic number that every character has in it. I'm guessing what that refers to. But it's weird that it doesn't come up till here instead of just being over here, and that it's considered part of birth, even though I see nothing in birth that affects it. Okay, you can select 10 cells with 10%. You can select the same one twice but not thrice, sure. I don't know what battle experience is, whether that's a skill or something else. Okay, some interesting things that can happen in adolescence. I don't feel like any of them are that, what do you call it? I don't know if formative is the right word. None of them are that really character defining to me. Like, these are easily things that could be completely irrelevant, I feel like, to a character. And since you only roll for birth and adolescence, I would think these are things that have more an effect, but I guess that's down to preference. Okay, and then your personality. And your personality isn't really based on these at all either. Oops. Choose a roll on the table below thrice to determine the most important aspect of your character's personality. Then roll 1d10 for each aspect, with 0, 2 as the left one, 3. Ugh. I don't know why, like, what led it to have to be that way, because it's just like having these be grouped together and then having two separate rolls instead of just a list that you roll on once is to me annoying. But, like, and I get that there's sort of a spectrum. I guess you wouldn't want someone to also get cowardly and brave at the same time, so it adds complexity, but it would have to be that way. Okay, I guess that works. Cowardly, brave, rash. These, however, I don't understand. I don't really know what tempered or unrestrained mean, and I don't know how they relate to sensitivity. Like, you'd think insensitive would be on the same thing as sensitive. So that's just a confusing set to me. Let me try and see if I can figure out what kind of a spread we've got here. So we've got stuff relating to bravery, stuff, I guess, relating to emotional control, stuff relating to selfishness / money, then politeness, pride, work ethic, maybe. How you get along with people. This is another one where it's kind of confusing. Like, witty, I guess you can see as positive, but only sort of, and inconsiderate and rude are both, just negative. So I think this is a decent spread, especially since none of them actually refer to definitive benefits like being intelligent or not, because that will be covered by skills. Okay, there is a gameplay effect. And that's interesting that there's a gameplay effect. Once again, I don't really know how. Like, I assume if you're using point buy, you just don't get this. Like, maybe you're supposed to buy these traits, but again, that's not really clear. Okay, once it's been activated, it can be activated for you. Like, during the same session, or forever in the future, or one time. Okay, so it's like a back and forth. Assuming that, the DM would want to use your trait against you because you were using it for you, it's kind of hard to consider how bravery would end up being a negative. Because, like, rash is there, but that's different than being brave, apparently. Like, definitively different. And that can be useful in some circumstances, but not for difficulty. Once again, flipping sometimes useful, sometimes not, so these are things, you know, your DM can mess with a lot. Okay, increase the quality of your roll by 1. Now that one, I was wondering how, like, you would use that for yourself. I would assume it would have to be once your health or sanity has hit 0, you would want to use it for yourself. But, you know, obviously the DM's ability to use this one in particular against you could be devastating. Now, okay. Just wanted to make sure that DM can deny it, because otherwise you could probably exploit this pretty easily to just basically never die. Because you have 3 chances to use it, and if the DM ever uses it against you, you get another chance, but the DM has to agree that you can actually activate this. Starting gear. 2d10 gold. Once again, this isn't something that I necessarily know how would be covered by point buy. Okay, so she rolls an 8. Picked on. Okay. I was seeing how the stuff on Brawl applied. I don't know why there's an exclamation point on there. I guess because it's exciting, I don't know. Got learn to read and write. Okay. That's useful, yeah. I was wondering, like, how, if you just wouldn't have learned to read and write if you didn't roll that, but you would just have to choose to put skill points into it at some point instead of sort of auto getting skill points there. I wonder if you have to roll each time you read. I feel like the quality is, or threshold rather, is very important there to make sure you auto pass a lot of reading. Okay. Noble and Drifter is special, and then we get these. Once again, not clear if this relates to point buy or it's just sort of another thing. It's very much not simple if you have to actively make tables for it. It's very funny that you can die of old age at 30. That might be a little too young. Yeah, in general, the aging seems extremely harsh compared to real life. Like, potentially every year. Let's see, getting 5 less smart every year after 30 potentially is a lot. No aging this year. I guess that's like a full half the table, so that's supposed to compensate for it. Yeah, I'm gonna guess that this is not well balanced, but it's something that would be fairly hard to tell without testing, and something that doesn't come up probably in most games, so it kind of doesn't matter that it's a little finicky there. Interesting that you can choose the same kit multiple times. Yeah, that seems like a bit of an unnecessary complexity there. But let's see. I don't know why we're adding the percentages to this now, because I feel like that's not something we were doing before. Like before, it's just 4d10 or something. You add 4d10 to read and write. You don't add 4d10% to read and write. I don't know why there's a percent here now. Maybe there's something I'm not understanding. Like, I guess it really maybe is supposed to be percent instead of just the straight value, even though the values themselves are representative of percentages in most D100 systems. And that would make the punishment less harsh, but it would also require more calculations, and like I said, it's kind of confusing based on how D100 systems normally work. Right, continuing on, looking at the kits. Plus 20 each in 2 combat skills. Plus 10 and 3 general. 20 to any, 10 to any. So normally it's 220 and 310. Oh, and then that's the generic one that you always get right. Okay, so it was general skills, like being a general. I would have assumed it was general as in generic, but since general is different than any, it might be, I don't know, commander, so to speak. I'll have to see what general skill means. Now, this might be battle expertise, not battle experience. That would make more sense as a skill. I want to make sure I know how many times you roll on a kit table. Yeah, so you roll once on the events. Yeah, so there's only one of these that is abjectly bad. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I like how each of these kits gives you so much choice. Like here, it's combat skills and general skills. That's a very wide selection. And here it's adventuring skills and, city skills. If you're selecting from 4 kits, well, potentially 4 kits, and each of them are also general in terms of what you can select, it almost makes it feel like, they may as well. It may as well just be pick whatever skills you want. It really doesn't feel like, especially since you can pick the same kit multiple times, it's hard to figure out how much material difference there would be for these, other than, I guess, the starting equipment and events, and just sort of freeform picking skills when things are pretty general. But I'd have to look, at the list of skills, because there are a ton of skills, and if you just were always picking, if each of these kits had hyper-specific ones, then most skills wouldn't end up being covered unless you had a ton of kits. Yeah, it looks like, again, there's only one definitive problem in the events. Okay, +1 spell, that's nice. I was wondering if whatever special ability Wizard gave you would be cumulative, because otherwise it would be difficult to, select the kit multiple times, but it does look like it would be an additional spell each time. Yeah, I'm just skimming these now because I think I got the gist of it. Now that seems markedly more specific than the other ones I've looked at so far. So those are 2 specific skills. That's interesting. Not sure. Dandy is really the right term for it, but perhaps that's just me. This looks like this has 2 definitively negative things. In the end, being a noble actively gives you less options, potentially. And it doesn't seem like courtly lore and lore are skills that are that hard to find, really. let's see, there's an possibility of 10d10 gold, which could be quite nice. And, 100 gold. That's a pretty good option. That's, I'd say, like the main thing that appears to set Noble apart. So this is interesting because it, subverts the format a bit. That gives you, I would assume, a ton of options. And then plus 10 in 4 different skills. So the only different thing there is you can't double up, but I didn't think you could double up anyway. And then plus 20 in any skill. So skill-wise, it looks like Drifter just gives you more options, but equipment, nothing amazing there, but it doesn't seem anything terrible either. Okay. Now, there doesn't really seem to be anything bad about being a drifter. That you could argue that it's better because you get more skills that you can select, it looks like. But let's go back to some of the starting equipment stuff. Yeah, other than maybe the equipment being like lackluster, it looks like Drifter is actually pretty solid as a kit. And not particularly bad. Like, it's potentially better, like I said, because you get so many options with the skills. Okay, so personal events only happen if you roll a 0 on your class event. Am I getting that right? You might have to scroll up for a while to really get an answer on that. Alright, for now I'm just going to assume that it is you only roll on those if you get the personal events table. Which also means it's very hard to get personal events, it kind of seems like. But these events are fairly big, except maybe that one so far. That one's really bad. Calculated values. Fairly complicated calculation for an RPG. Like math-wise simple, but especially if people don't know the operations used here, it'll be tough. Like a skill divided by 4 plus 5. Well, 2 skills divided by 4 plus 5. Right. Now this is even more complicated, I believe. 5... What? 5 minus 15 in parentheses. I don't know what that means in this context. Because, like, looking at this just based on my basic knowledge of math, first of all, first thing you do is subtract 15 from 5, getting negative 10. Which, why that wouldn't just be written as negative 10, I don't know. Then you would... Okay, then you would, let's see... You would have to do the multiplication next, and it's 5 plus athletics divided by 10, and the question of whether you do athletics divided by 10, then times that times negative 10, or you do 10 times negative 10, and then use that as the divisor for athletics, can get complicated depending on how you interpret notation. Like if that were all under athletics with a line, that would make things simpler, but it's not. The other issue is just, I don't know why there's a negative 10 in there. I think this operation might just be written wrong. Well, not operation, but this equation. And then all of that is, movement is minus all of that. There's no equal sign. Is that supposed to be one of those squiggles? If it was, that would be way too complicated for just an RPG. Okay, I don't understand this at all. Defense is the threshold of the defense skill. So, defense is a skill, but there's also defense that is not a skill, but is a derivative of the skill. You probably want a different naming convention there. Okay, threshold of battle expertise. Can't remember what threshold is. It's something dividing and then rounding up, but I can't quite remember. Alright, let me see if I can find where I left off. Yeah, initiative, I think. So, you find a carry, up to your carry capacity. However, you don't appear to actually get negatives until you carry twice it. So I'm not sure what happens in the middle. Like, you can carry, say, 10 things, but then you don't actually have problems till you carry 20, and then you can effectively carry 19 things. I'm not sure I'm understanding this. Okay, I think what it's supposed to be here is, if you carry above your carry capacity, you get encumbered. And then here, if you carry 2 times it or above, you get increasingly encumbered. but the phrasing isn't great. And I was wondering if they would explain how exactly the quality affected, the amount of the roll. Question is, I'm not even sure how you could get above a 10. Right. Interesting that chess would be philosophy for some reason. Oh, okay, I may have confused things. So for some reason, I was thinking it was like just the number for the tens die. Just like if it was 90, then the quality would be 9. But it looks like you actually look at the full number, minus the ones digit. So that means a lot of these are far easier to get than I would have thought. But no, that would mean, like, as long as the Q is higher than the difficulty, or is a 1, then it would automatically be a 10, and that's clearly wrong. So I think quality is supposed to be a single digit just of the 1 in the tens place. And so having this table be the full digit makes things very confusing. Yeah, the tens digit must be on or above. And yet, here we have, not just the digit represented, but the full value. And that creates confusion over what exactly is meant. Okay. So the only case you have to roll in a time where there's plenty of preparation is when the difficulty is greater than the threshold, which is assumedly your threshold. And if that's the case, you only have to roll when you would automatically fail. I think the way that is written could probably be streamlined. No, never mind. Threshold is different than I thought it was. Okay, I read that already. Yeah, I feel like they've had exceptional rolls in advantage and disadvantage at least 3 times, which is really more than you need. Generally, having something gone over in full twice at most is all you'll need. Alright, looking at the skill list now. Yeah, I think since what a skill applies to what is going to be so important in this system, because you basically just get skills, there should be some sort of description of how a player might suggest a certain skill be used in a certain situation to the GM. Because, like, some stuff like endurance sound like they could end up being missed fairly easily, but when there's already stuff like health and guard, but if I remember right, guard at least might be based on endurance, so that'll naturally help that too. Okay, so this had about 5 skills in the general category. And basically all the general skills you get a starting amount for. And this was adventure. We've got city. Wilderness. Lore. Interesting that there are only 2 magic skills, but wizard definitely lets you pick, I think. Yeah, so if it fails or is exceptional, like this line doesn't appear to mesh with this line. I'm not sure if this is saying that additionally, if the roll fails, you check the box, or if it's saying additionally, when a roll fails or is exceptional, you also increase by 1d10. After by. Okay, so that's weird. It looks like if you check the box, and then if you fail at it, or you get exceptional, the skill then increases by 1d10. This seems kind of overcomplicated, but basically that part makes it easier for you to, increase in a skill if you are bad at it, which kind of makes sense. Like, I know all of this is similar somewhat to Call of Cthulhu, but it's been so long since I've looked at it that I can't tell how similar. Okay, what I wanted to do was go back. Well, first of all, look at the spread of skills they have in general. Only 2 for magic, that's fine. A lot of different combat-related skills, which is fair. Some lore stuff. Which makes sense. Let's see here. Navigational hunt. A lot of stuff making survival, that makes sense. And the city skills. And we move on to adventuring. I'm tired, so I can't tell for certain, but it doesn't seem like there's any huge gaps in terms of the kind of skill you would want for this type of game. And so it looks like if I had to pick things that were missing, I just sort of glanced at the D&D skill list for comparison. I would think maybe wouldn't use something like Call of Cthulhu because that contains so many modern specific skills. But it looks like deception and intimidation, aren't really covered except maybe by this. And I suppose it's fair to have all kinds of speech covered by Speechcraft. It certainly helps. It certainly helps not have the issue of lying always being worse than telling the truth, because people can just roll against it to tell. But yeah, it's worth noting that Speechcraft covers a very wide brush. Whereas other things like, say, navigate, scout, hunt, and bushcraft, which all seem fairly similar, have their own separate skills for them. Like, if you want to, be good out in the wilderness, you have to have so many different skills and so many different things to try and have coverage. But if you just want to be good at talking to people in a wide variety of ways, it's only one skill you need to up. And that's probably a pretty ineffective imbalance. That's probably going to cause problems. Alright, but that's like the only big thing I'm thinking of with the skills. You gotta be careful about how many times you're splitting similar categories into different skills versus having one blanket skill that can cover a bunch of different, more niche areas. Because that creates a balance issue. Training. Once you cross the skill in question. Okay. Okay. I'm just skimming most of this because I can't quite remember where talents apply. Encumbrance. Alright. What I'm looking for here is to get a look at, I think it's just, gold that you've picked up from elements of character creation that you spend stuff on, but I want to double check that you don't have any other additional starting gold. Yeah, it doesn't look like it. Alright, so I need to go back and look at what you get talents from, but also look at the spread of things you get from different classes. Like I said, this one, you pretty much take whatever skills you want. This one, two very specific things. Rather, a bunch of very specific things. This one, two specific things, and then a lot of city skill stuff. This one, just a ton of lore skills. This one, wilderness in general. So far, not a ton of things giving you much wilderness. Yeah, magical and lore. Okay, adventuring skills. It looks like combat skills and, wilderness skills you can't really get except for with 2 kits or using your free points. But I'm not seeing a huge problem in the spread of skills across kits. We just make sure every category is represented somehow. A lot of things did general. Thief, at least I remember doing adventure, I think. Someone did adventure, probably. Definitely some city. Barely any wilderness, but some. A ton of lore. There ended up being a little bit of combat. Okay. So one thing I was looking at was how many ones have adventure. Okay. Okay, yeah, the rogue gets adventure skills. Alright, now I need to go back and look at talents. Step by step, 9. Okay. Kit calculations, finishing touches. So where do talents come from? Okay, different sources. So they're kind of random when they come up. Alright, so I've looked through a lot of this by now. Before I really finish forming my thoughts, I think I'm going to look at the general rules so I can know certain things like how combat goes. But as for character creation, well, as for the game itself, I like a lot of the interesting things that are being done with dice, like the same number equals a crit, but it can be positive or negative depending on success or failure, I think is really interesting. The advantage being flipping it. There's a lot of little the difficulty values working the way they do, I think is also cool. The auto success chances, I'm not sure how to feel about, but definitely don't seem like a bad idea. So I like a lot of all the little changes to how the dice work in a systems like this. I think they're all interesting. As for character creation itself, species. So, I think the character creation is fine, but nothing really jumps out at me as being interesting. It doesn't seem that simple. It's mostly selecting skills, except things that get randomly selected for you, and most of them are not that interesting to me. For me, there's just nothing for me to. Character creation seems functional, but there's nothing that really grabs my attention. It's doing the whole character creation is actually representative of the phases your character goes through life thing that a couple systems do, but it's not focused on to the point that I can really see character creation as about that. It's just sort of something that happens during it. And some of the stuff that happens there is kind of interesting, but none of it seems hugely impactful. It's sort of caught between trying to be a general system or just a general character creation process and focusing on that whole randomization and development element. And I don't think it's a mishmash that really lands in an area that I like. Maybe I could just do point buy if I didn't like some of the things that I'm not able to choose myself. But point buy is sort of poorly explained. The kits let you choose skills, but they don't really limit your choice of skill enough in a way. Not only are the the specific quote unquote skills you get from it kind of general, but you also get free skills from it to the point that it barely feels like the kit matters in terms of skill selection, at least from a outside not playing it perspective. In terms of the, equipment and events you can get from a kit, that's kind of interesting, but you can only get up to 4 of those if you select all 4 kits. It's just in a situation where it's hard to really, for me to describe character creation in a way. Let me try and go back to the beginning here and go through it a bit. Concept, yeah, species and culture. Yeah, so basically, you pick your species, that would probably dictate some stuff, and it has some minor effects on health and sanity. But your culture might give you a good idea of the personality. Next, you move on to birth. Right, you get a detail which you can't pick for yourself, but also might not really impact anything, and I'm not even talking about mechanics, like mother died giving birth to you. That could be hugely impactful on a character or meaningless. That one, that's more significant. Like birthday unknown, that's really, like, I don't even know what that's useful for. Born on a particular day, like a day mentioned in prophecy would be significant, but everything else is kind of just like born on a day. Like that is very undescriptive. Birthmark. Like these feel very sort of ineffectual at impacting a lot of stuff. Okay, moving on to adolescence. You get to select skills, but that's something you're doing throughout. Okay, now 2 things can happen to you this time. Was there more for birth? No, it's just 1 rule on birth. But let's see. This has a mechanical effect, but it is just accident. Outside of, so in terms of like story, that doesn't necessarily impact much. Same with death in the family. You don't know if it's close family or extended. Could mean something or nothing. War, that one's significant. Friend as a contact. Same with mentor. I'd say those are both relatively significant. Young love, probably. Bullied, probably. Outdoor kid, but it's got mechanical stuff to it. Yeah, so a lot of adolescence, at least, the events kind of seem to have an effect. Then personality traits, like any time you don't really pick the personality yourself for your character is something I'm not going to be a fan of personally. So overall, character creation for me is just, a lot of it is picking skills. Some of the events are interesting, but not so interesting, either in terms of how they affect the story or how they affect the mechanics, that they make up for not getting to pick them yourself for me. And then the rest of it just amounts to adding points to skills. So for character creation just being such an involved process, there really is not a lot to grab me or make me interested in it. And so it's one of those situations where it's like, there's not really anything wrong with most of the system here. Like, I'm sure I picked up on a few flaws here and there. Sometimes the math seemed like it was written kind of wrong, but overall, I'm not seeing any big flaws. It's just I'm not seeing any huge positives. I wouldn't really know how to recommend this system to someone. Like, it's a D100 system, and it is definitely less complicated than some of them. But, like, kind of the benefit of a D100 system in the first place is usually the complexity. And it's not really advertising what the benefits of a D100 system are in the rulebook. And basically, like, if I take a wider view of this, if I had to describe this to someone, a big part of what I would say would just be it's a D100 system, because that's one of the few things I know about it. Other than that, it doesn't have a huge amount of identity, which, can be fine in theory. You can have a system that is fully intended to be generic, but with having specific races, with having this birth to adolescence character creation process and all of that, it doesn't really seem like it's fully going for generic, especially with magic, having a definitive cost and a way it works. And it's not like 100% simple. You're not just plugging in points to skills, there's other stuff going on. So it's a system I feel like that doesn't have a huge sense of identity, and that's probably my main complaint about it. Otherwise, it seems like it'd work fine, and I really like a lot of the little things that are happening with dice. I think that's interesting. Like, if someone DM'd, someone was DMing this system and I was a player in the campaign, I think I would probably enjoy it, but there's nothing about this system that would make me want to run it or make me ask someone to run it for me. And I glanced at some of this. Don't really love the formatting. I don't think the text is well economized in terms of screen space. But seems like a fairly tactical combat system, kind of dueling based. The only thing a couple things to take note of. It's not clear what being engaged means in terms of exchanged blows. That should definitely be, more one-sided. One side attacking the other, not necessarily a quote-unquote exchange, depending on how you define that. Otherwise, it's too easy for ranged players to run. It's worth noting that, even though this is supposed to be a system where combat can be pretty dangerous, if you're significantly above the, skill level of an enemy, they probably wouldn't even be able to hit you based on your defense versus their skill in combat. On the other hand, the same is true of you and stronger enemies potentially, so that could definitely add to the difficulty and danger of combat. I definitely get a lot more of a sense of the identity of the game from the combat rules than I do for the character creation rules, and finding a way to bring them together would be, I think, pretty good. Trying to think of those, because I didn't read these deeply, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to just throw in and mention. Oh yeah, this is sort of a side note, but I don't see weapon switching rules. That can be pretty complicated for a lot of systems, and they sometimes just leave it up to the GM, but for yours, I think it'll be pretty critical for, since there are so many caveats to being engaged with someone. It would make sense to have ranged attacks have certain advantages, and one of them could be that it takes an action to switch between your bow and your, say, sword when someone comes up close to you. In addition, it would also give you a reason for using thrown weapons or throwing weapons. I can see that, I could see that was a combat skill in the character creation, but potentially there's not much reason to actually throw a weapon versus using a, actual ranged weapon in a lot of systems. And I could see it making sense for this one to use on an enemy who is fleeing, because, just throwing your melee weapon instead of taking the action to switch to a ranged one. So that could potentially be another benefit to switching weapons having some kind of cost or taking an action. On the other hand, you could also potentially just chase the person running away, especially when disengagement options can be so complicated. Not complicated, but can all come with a cost. The combat is definitely interesting. Like I said, I really feel like it has more of a sense of identity for me than the character creation. I can tell a lot more easily from it what the game's supposed to be like. So finding a way to bring that into character creation, I think, would be beneficial.